There was a city tucked between the rolling hills and the wide Okiri River. Its name was Nduma, a place where ancient drums still echoed during festivals, but tall glass towers now reached for the skies. The scent of roasted yam and grilled catfish mixed with car fumes and perfume. In one corner, grandmothers sold fresh ugu leaves on straw mats. In another, lawyers in suits shouted into phones. This city was growing fast, but it still carried the soul of its elders. In a red brick house at the edge of the city's oldest neighborhood lived the Obeid family. They were known for their discipline, their manners, and their quiet pride. Baba Dairo Obade worked at the Ministry of Lands, a stern man with sharp eyes and high standards. Mama Ireti Obade ran a small but famous Ankara shop in Nduma's main market. She wrapped her hair in tight cloths and wrapped her love even tighter. If you asked her how her children were doing, she would only smile if there were medals to show. They had 2 daughters, and in the eyes of everyone, especially their parents, only one truly mattered. Zalina, the firstborn, was like lightning in a bottle. She won every prize. She topped every exam. She danced in the school play and gave the final speech at the prize-giving ceremony. She walked into rooms and people turned. By the time she was 14, teachers whispered, "That one will go far." Then there was Tisola, 3 years younger, quiet like a question no one wanted to ask. Tisola was not a failure, no. She just wasn't Zalina. While Zalina's voice carried like a preacher's, Tisola's barely rose above a whisper. Where? Her sister loved the spotlight. Tisola found peace in corners. She read books that had no pictures, studied old court rulings for fun, and drew charts on scrap paper while others were out playing 10-10. Their parents praised Zalina with every breath. Neighbors called her the Golden Daughter. At dinner, Baba Dairo would ask her to explain global politics, and Mama Ireti would clap like she had just heard music. Then they would look at Tisola and say things like, "Why don't you speak up more? Or can't you be bold like your sister?" Zalina basked in the attention. She did not bully Tisola outright, but her smirks cut sharper than any slap. When visitors came, she would say things like, "Oh, Tisola, she just likes to hide in her books, or she's still trying to figure out what she wants." It was true. Tisola didn't shine the same way, but she was building something, quietly, patiently. At night, when the house was still and the city had gone to sleep, Tisola would sit with her old laptop, one that froze every few minutes, and dig into legal cases, business reports, and loopholes no one else noticed. She started writing suggestions on online forums using fake names. She answered legal questions and solved firm problems without anyone knowing who she was. By her final year of secondary school, she had quietly launched Tisola Advisory, a hidden consulting service that connected struggling law firms with winning strategies. She built documents, corrected contracts, and helped firms win court cases they were sure to lose. No one knew she was just 17. While Zalina was bragging about getting into Obunaiki University of Law, Tisola was already sending invoices under her company's name and getting paid. By graduation, Tisola was working with more than 50 law firms across the region. She had never entered a courtroom, but her words were echoing through them daily. At Tisola's graduation ceremony, Mama Ireti sighed as the school handed her daughter a quiet, Most Improved award. She looked at Tisola with a mixture of confusion and pity. "Zalina is going to Obunaiki, and you're taking a gap year to do what? Discover yourself?" Tisola smiled softly. She didn't tell them that her gap year was actually phase 1 of her 5-year expansion plan. She didn't mention the consulting fees she was stacking, or that her tiny savings account was already close to 7 figures in Naira. And she certainly didn't reveal that 3 of the law firms Zalina admired most had already paid her to fix their operations. Zalina went to Obunaiki and soared even higher. Her name appeared in local newspapers. She won debating championships and internship slots that were harder to get than visas. Every school holiday, she returned home with fresh stories, fresh awards, and fresh reasons for Baba Dairo and Mama Ireti to sing her praises. Meanwhile, Tisola stayed silent, but not still. She took online business courses, just enough to keep her parents quiet. Behind the scenes, she created shell companies and bought small shares in law firms. When she saw two firms fighting over land rights, she brought them together, not as a lawyer but as a strategist. When one firm almost collapsed over tax debts, she showed them how to restructure. By the time Zelina graduated top of her class, Tisola controlled 7 major firms across the Eastlands, but in the family's eyes she was still the unsure one, the dreamer. The girl who hadn't figured it out. That illusion broke when Zelina got her first job, a high-paying position at Kintu and Obele Chambers, one of the most respected firms in Nduma. She danced through the office halls on her first day, feeling like a queen. She had no idea that Tisola had bought controlling shares in that firm 6 months earlier. Tisola watched quietly as her sister climbed a ladder she had built. At a family dinner, Zelina leaned back in her chair and smiled wide. "Tano, you should. See my office? Corner suite, personal assistant, and the managing partner said I'm already on the partnership track. In 5 years, I'll be running things." Then she turned to Tisola with a curious smirk. "And you? Still playing with that little consulting project?" Tisola just smiled and sipped her sobo. "Something like that," she said. In truth, she was in the middle of her biggest deal yet, acquiring Obalumo Legal Group, the largest firm in the region. If it went through, she would become the quiet queen of Nduma's legal world before her 25th birthday. But Zelina, used to being the family star, didn't like that the light was shifting. When Tisola was seen talking to Kenan Oladeji, a handsome and powerful legal counsel from a wealthy family, Zelina took notice. At a family gathering, she whispered to Mama Ireti, "He's old money, Ma. He'll want someone sharp, polished." That's not really Tisola's world. What Zelina didn't know was that Kenan and Tisola had already met months ago, in a boardroom, not a ballroom. He had been representing Obalumo in a merger, and she had been the quiet voice on the other side. He was drawn to her mind first, and then to her heart. 6 months later, he proposed. Zelina nearly lost her breath. She had been eyeing him for herself, hinting at her own interest, bragging about her career. But Tisola, the overlooked one, had taken him without trying. "She doesn't even have a proper job," Zelina whispered to their mother in anger. "Something's not right." Her jealousy turned to obsession. When Tisola asked her to be maid of honor, Zelina said yes, not out of love, but for access. She read every email. She asked about every guest. She followed every whisper. What she found scared her. The numbers didn't add up. The calls Tisola made didn't match her story. The people she spoke to were too powerful, too distant for someone with a little consulting job. Zelina began collecting secrets, dates, documents, screenshots. She was sure she had uncovered something huge. So she made a plan. She chose Tisola's wedding day as the perfect time to reveal everything, to tear the curtain and expose her sister before the whole city. But what she didn't know was this. Tisola had already seen it coming, because some sisters are not raised to be friends. Some are raised to teach each other the hardest lessons, and Tisola, the quiet one, was ready. The morning sun rose gently over Nduma, casting long golden fingers across the narrow streets and wide hills. Drummers were already playing softly in the distance, as if the ancestors themselves were humming. The scent of jasmine mixed with fresh dew from the grass, and from every corner of the city came whispers of the grand wedding that would take place that day at Oluma Cathedral, the most sacred house of worship in the region. Built with tall, carved stones and windows colored like storybooks, Oluma stood in the heart of the city like a silent elder, regal, wise, and unshaken by time. Its bell tower touched the sky, and the white pigeons that circled it each morning were said to carry blessings to the heavens. Inside, the pews were filled with the highest of Nduma's elite. Chiefs with leopard skin cloaks sat beside city judges in polished robes. Legal scholars, journalists, professors, and top investors from around the continent all turned their heads as one when the groom, Kenan Oladeji, walked toward the altar in a fitted cream agbada embroidered with gold. His presence was calm, but there was power in every step, the kind of man born into legacy and now expanding it through quiet brilliance. But it was the bride that no one could stop staring at, Tisola Obade. She stepped slowly down the aisle, not with trembling fear but with quiet fire in her eyes. Her white dress floated like smoke behind her, and the veil over her head shimmered in the sunlight streaming through the colored glass above. Her skin glowed like bronze kissed by moonlight. Her posture, upright, composed, carried a kind of nobility no crown could offer. Some whispered she looked like a queen. Others just watched in awe, unsure why they suddenly felt so small. Her sister Zelina stood nearby, dressed in flowing indigo lace, her head held high. She wore the title of Maid of Honor, but anyone who looked closely could see the bitterness burning behind her eyes. Zelina's smile was tight, her jaw clenched. She had been planning this moment for months, not the wedding itself, but what would happen during it. She had combed through emails. She had questioned Tisola's past, her business, her friends. She had followed whispers in the legal world, tried to find cracks in her sister's story. Anything that would prove Tisola didn't deserve the life she had built. And what she found had shaken her, because the truth was even worse than what she imagined. It wasn't that Tisola had faked success. It was that she had surpassed every measure of it, quietly, powerfully, invisibly. And Zelina, the golden child, the Harvard graduate, the family's pride, had been standing in her shadow all along. She couldn't take it. And so, when the minister raised his voice and asked the old question, "If anyone here knows a reason these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace," the air thickened. Everyone sat still except Zelina. She stood, slowly, deliberately. Her blue lace rustled, her heels clicked on the marble floor. A smile, wicked and proud, pulled at her lips. Gasps rose from the pews. Heads turned. Murmurs passed like wind through tall grass. Tisola did not flinch. Kenan gently squeezed her hand, but she remained calm, her eyes fixed forward. Zelina stepped forward, holding a bouquet in one hand, and a thick brown folder hidden beneath it. Her voice rang out, loud and clear. "Before we all continue with this show," she said, pausing to scan the crowd, "I believe it's time someone spoke the truth." Their mother gasped from her seat. Their father's jaw tightened. Elder. Guests shifted in discomfort. "Everyone here believes they're celebrating the union of a noble man and a simple woman," Zelina went on. "A woman who claims to be nothing more than a humble consultant, a business advisor, a quiet helper. But that's not who she is, and everyone deserves to know." She tossed the bouquet aside and opened the folder with a dramatic snap. Poesia rustled. The silence was deafening. "This woman, Tisola, is a liar." Gasps filled the church. "She has been hiding her true identity behind fake companies, shady business deals, and silent takeovers. She's not a consultant. She's a manipulator, a pretender, and she's fooled even you, Kenan." She turned to him. "While you were working hard to negotiate the Obalumo acquisition, your bride was the one orchestrating the entire thing behind your back. She's been collecting companies like stones, buying them in silence, hiding behind shells, and now she owns most of the law firms in this city." The crowd buzzed, some gasped, some leaned forward. Others looked to Tisola. She was still calm, still watching. Zelina waved a paper in the air. "I have proof. Bank records, names of companies, everything leading back to her." "And what is your point?" Tisola finally spoke, her voice soft but strong. "That I did something wrong." Zelina froze for a second, thrown by her sister's confidence. "You didn't go to law school," she snapped. "You're not even qualified to run any of these firms. You fooled the entire industry." "You're right," Tisola said, stepping forward. "I didn't go to law school. I was too busy building something that no classroom could teach." She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Around the church, guests' phones began vibrating. Some looked down, others read out loud, heads turned, mouths dropped. "To the distinguished guests," Tisola said, lifting her chin, "I am pleased to officially announce that as of this moment, Tisola Advisory Holdings has completed its full acquisition of Obalumo Legal Group." A wave of shock hit the crowd. "This merger makes us the largest legal network in the entire Eastlands. And yes, Zelina, I did it without a law degree. I did it by outworking, outthinking, and outlasting every obstacle thrown my way." Zelina's face turned white. "That's not possible," she whispered. "You're my little sister, the one everyone ignored." "Yes," Tisola said gently. "The disappointment who now owns the firm you've been working at for the past year. I've read your performance reports, by the way. They're not impressive." The folder slipped from Zelina's hands. Pages fluttered to the floor like falling leaves. She stood frozen. Tisola turned to the guests. "Chief Whale," she called, addressing one of the elders in the front row. "You recently sold part of your practice to a company listed as Goma Capital, correct?" The man blinked. "Yes." "That's one of mine." The room erupted in low murmurs. Zelina staggered. "What about the Anderson case?" Tisola added, her eyes narrowing. "The one you took credit for last month. The actual records show you barely touched it. The associates did the work. You just claimed the victory." Zelina looked around desperately, but no one came to her defense. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "You wouldn't expose me like this." Tisola's smile was faint. "You already exposed yourself." From the back, an older man rose, Elder Kofi, former head of the Bar Council. "It is true," he said slowly. "I have seen the documents. I knew someone powerful was behind these mergers. I never imagined it was you, child." Their mother stood now, her voice trembling. "Tisola, why didn't you ever tell us?" "Because you never asked," she said. "You were too busy comparing me to your favorite daughter to notice I had become more than you ever dreamed." She turned to Zelina. "Do you still want to reveal secrets?" Zelina opened her mouth, but no sound came. Tisola stepped back beside Keenan, who took her hand once more. The minister, stunned, looked between the sisters. Then he cleared his throat. "Well, shall we proceed?" Zelina slumped back into her seat, defeated, shaking. Her plan to destroy her sister had only unmasked her own bitterness, and as Tisola turned back toward the altar, veil lifted, face glowing, the cathedral felt different. This was no longer just a wedding. It was a coronation. The forgotten sister had become a queen. Zelina's folder lay scattered on the floor like a broken truth. She had planned for triumph, a dramatic unmasking, a thunderclap of gasps, and a ruined wedding. But what she received was silence. Not the stunned silence of betrayal, but the silence of people who already knew. People who had already made up their minds. People who were not on her side. Tisola remained still at the altar, her white gown flowing like river mist, her fingers gently curled around Keenan's hand. The only movement was her slow, steady breathing, not the breath of a bride shaken by shame, but of a woman who had been waiting for this moment like the moon waits for night. Zelina's voice cracked now. "It's not true, you can't believe her." But Tisola took one graceful step forward. "In fact," she said, her voice even and soft, "your main contribution at Kintu and Obele was taking credit for the hard work of those beneath you. You fused your juniors like a ladder, Zelina, and kicked it away once you climbed." Zelina's lip trembled. "That's not true," she said weakly. But Tisola tilted her head slightly. "The records disagree. So do the formal complaints filed by your team. The ones you thought no one saw. They've been sitting in HR for months, in a firm I now own." Gasps flickered through the crowd again, softer this time, like wind brushing. Through reeds, Chief Iyaro, a respected judge, whispered something to his wife. Madame Arinze, head of the Bar Council, raised an eyebrow, and then Keenan Oladeji, still holding Tisola's hand, stepped forward. "There's something you should all know," he said, voice calm, almost amused. "As Chief Counsel for Obalumo Legal Group, I've known who Tisola truly is since the beginning." Zelina turned toward him, eyes wide. "We met during the first phase of the merger," Keenan continued. "Long before that charity gala where you tried to warn me about her. I knew exactly who she was and what she was building." Zelina's face crumbled. She turned, searching for someone, anyone, to support her. But all she saw were the nodding faces of Nduma's elite. These were not her allies. These were the same powerful figures who had, unknowingly, been working for Tisola all along. They recognized her now, not just the girl in white, but the strategist behind their recent successes, the architect behind the balance sheets they couldn't explain. Tisola straightened her dress and turned back to her sister. "Well then, Zelina, do you want to keep exposing secrets?" Her voice was kind, too kind. It stung worse than anger. Zelina stood frozen. Her victory had vanished. Her moment had twisted into a mirror she couldn't escape. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked at last, her voice barely a whisper. Tisola looked at her for a long moment. "You never asked," she replied. "You were too busy looking down at me to notice I'd already risen above you." Then she turned to the minister. "Shall we continue?" But Zelina wasn't quite finished. As she lowered herself into her seat, her lips curled, and she whispered, "This isn't over." Tisola caught her gaze and smiled. "Actually, it is. Check your email." Zelina's phone buzzed a second later. She lifted it with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the message, and her body tensed. The crowd watched. In silence as her face turned pale, then grey. "You've been officially terminated from Kintu and Obele," Tisola said gently. "Effective immediately." You can't fire me," Zelina hissed. "I'm not firing you," Tisola replied. "The evidence of misconduct and credit theft is firing you. I'm just the owner who approved it." The minister shifted, awkwardly at the altar, his hands fumbling with his prayer book. "I think, perhaps, shall we return to the ceremony?" he asked cautiously. Tisola gave a small nod. The guests slowly settled, whispering behind raised fans and folded programs. The fire in the room had changed. The ceremony was still a wedding, but it felt like something more, something heavier, something final. As Tisola turned back toward the altar, she passed by one of the tall stained-glass windows. In the colored reflection, she didn't see the shy little sister she once was. She saw a leader, a force, a woman who had carved power out of silence, and, as she glanced back toward Zelina, now slumped in her blue lace dress, jaw clenched and fingers twitching, Tisola realized something simple and pure. Sometimes the loudest revenge is success no one saw coming. The minister continued with the vows. Keenan spoke his lines with clear devotion, his voice firm and warm. Tisola repeated hers without hesitation. There was no quiver in her tone, no pause in her words. She was ready, not just for marriage, but for a new season. The moment she said, "I do," the whole church exhaled as if the air had been held too long. But Tisola knew deep down, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Zelina's words echoed in her mind, "This isn't over," and she believed it. Her sister would not sit still. Zelina had never handled humiliation well. She was the kind who burned everything just to prove she could still light a match. But what Zelina didn't know was that Tisola had already counted on this. That night, the reception at the Grand Ijele Conference Hall, perched above the banks of the Oseife River, should have been filled with laughter and music. But shadows hung over the celebration. Tisola and Keenan moved across the dance floor with grace, their hands clasped, their steps light. Friends and allies greeted them with cheers, toasts, and gifts wrapped in silken cloth. But beneath the cheer, Tisola could feel it, the waiting, the watching. It didn't take long. She was only halfway through her first dance when Zelina struck again. Her phone buzzed, an urgent message from one of her media contacts. Tisola read the headline and let out a soft breath. Harvard graduate exposes sister's fraudulent empire. A deep dive into corporate espionage, secret takeovers, and legal manipulation, Zelina had gone straight from the church to the media. The article painted Tisola as a cunning fraud, a woman who had risen to power through deceit and silence. It suggested that she had spied on competitors, created fake companies, and threatened law firms into merging under her name. Tisola turned the screen to Keenan. He scanned it, then raised a brow. "She really doesn't know when to stop, does she?" he said. "No," Tisola replied, "but I was ready." She glanced across the room. Standing quietly near the edge of the bar was Kioma, her chief of operations, a fierce, brilliant woman with braided hair and eyes sharp like lioness claws. Tisola nodded once. Kioma pulled out her phone and began to work. Within the hour, every major news outlet in Nduma and beyond received a sealed digital press kit from Tisola Advisory Holdings. Inside was a complete timeline of Tisola's rise, official registrations, tax clearances, merger filings, and compliance records approved by the National Legal Authority. Even after being silenced in front of hundreds, Zelina was not done. While guests sipped palm wine and savored goat suya under the golden chandeliers of Ijele Hall, Zelina moved like a whisper through the crowd. Her lace gown swept across the marble floors as she slipped from group to group, leaning in close to judges, lawmakers, and partners from Nduma's most powerful firms. Her voice was low, almost sweet, but her words were poison. "Did you know," she said to one old councilman, "that Tisola's been recording all your private conversations?" She turned to another, eyes wide with faux concern. Every firm she bought, she gathered dirt first. She didn't rise through wisdom. She rose through blackmail. From across the room, Tisola saw her sister weaving her last threads of deceit. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Every single person Zelina approached had already received Tisola's message earlier that afternoon. A quiet warning that Zelina, bruised by humiliation, might try to twist the truth. The moment that finally broke the tension came when Zelina, with fire rising in her voice, marched toward Chief Oladeji, Kenan's father and one of the most respected elders in Nduma's legal circle. She spoke just loud enough for heads to turn. "Chief," she said, "I have proof that Tisola blackmailed you into the merger. She threatened to expose your offshore accounts. She forced this whole alliance." The room froze. Glasses were lowered. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Chief Oladeji stared at her for a moment. Then, with a deep, warm laugh that echoed off the tall pillars, he replied, "Miss Obade, or should I say, former attorney Zelina, your sister never blackmailed me." His words landed like thunder. "She helped me," he continued, looking around the room. "She showed me how to clean up those accounts before anyone else could. She saved my company from disgrace, not dragged it into one. That's why I trusted her with the merger. That's why I admire her." Zelina's face turned red. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. She staggered a step backward, her fingers fumbling for something to say. And then, from behind, Tisola's voice rose. Calm but unshakable. "You thought you found my secrets," Tisola said, stepping closer. "But I knew you were going through my files. Every document you discovered was placed there for you to find. Crafted, planted, and timed. You followed the trail I created." Zelina spun around, her voice cracking. "No, that's impossible. The files, the statements, the accounts, I saw them." "They were all legal," Tisola answered softly. "All traceable. All a part of operations I've been managing transparently from the start. Did you really think I wouldn't prepare for exactly this kind of attack?" Their parents stood a few feet away, stunned. For the first time, the sharp certainty in Baba Dairo's voice was gone. His eyes, once always proud of Zelina, now searched her face with something like disappointment. "Zelina," he said quietly, "enough." But she wasn't finished. Her hand trembled as she pulled out her phone. "I have recordings, screenshots, copies of documents she tried to hide." Kenan stepped in, his voice cutting through the tension. "No, you don't," he said. "As Chief Legal Counsel for Obalumo, I can confirm that any attempt to remove confidential materials from Kintu and Obele would be a breach of contract, a serious one. And if you share or use any of those files, you're violating ethics. You could be disbarred." Zelina blinked, her breath catching. "You wouldn't dare report me." Tisola met her gaze. "I don't need to dare. You've already done enough to report yourself, attempting to derail a legal merger with false claims, leaking internal materials to the press, slandering people at their own wedding." She took out her phone and showed the screen, a formal complaint already prepared for submission to Nduma's legal counsel. Zelina's voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "You're bluffing." Tisola's eyes softened. "No, I'm giving you one last choice. Walk away, leave Nduma. Take the severance I still offered you, and start over, or stay and watch everything you've built collapse under your own pride." Their mother, Mama Ireti, stepped forward at last, tears in her eyes, but they were not tears for Tisola. They were for Zelina. "You ruined yourself," she said softly. "Not with mistakes, but with pride. You were so focused on proving you were better than Tisola, you never realized she already was." Zelina looked around the room. Every guest she'd tried to convince was now shaking their head or refusing to meet her eyes. Even her former allies, the ones she once bragged about knowing by name, now saw her as a child who had thrown sand at the wind, only to have it blow back in her face. Her voice cracked again. "Fine, you win." She swallowed hard. "You've always been playing a longer game, haven't you?" Tisola didn't move. "The difference is, I was building to win. You were just playing to make me lose." Zelina turned and walked away. Her dress trailed behind her like the last echo of an ending. No one followed her. No one called out her name. And as the door closed behind her, the room exhaled. For a long while, Tisola stood in silence, watching where her sister had gone. Then, as if returning to the moment, she looked toward Keenan, her husband, and smiled. "You okay?" he asked gently, touching her shoulder. She nodded. "I am. It needed to end this way." Her parents approached again. Baba Dairo, quiet and shaken, placed his hand on her back. "We didn't know," he said. "We thought we saw everything. We thought you were lost." "You saw what you expected to see," Tisola said gently. "Zelina was the star. I was the quiet one. But while you looked at her light, I was building mine in the dark." The rest of the evening unfolded slowly, not as a wedding celebration, but as something deeper. People approached not just to congratulate, but to apologize, to confess their surprise, to honor her. What had started as a wedding had become something else. It was the rise of someone they had all overlooked. Later that night, just as Tisola and Keenan were preparing to leave for their honeymoon, her phone buzzed with a final message. It was from Zelina. "You've won. I'm leaving Nduma, maybe heading to Nairobi or Lagos. You taught me something. Appearances lie. Someday, when you least expect it, I'll build something too, and we'll see who really wins." Tisola stared at the message. Keenan looked over her shoulder. "You think she means it?" Tisola smiled faintly. "She might try." She slipped the phone into her bag. "But it takes more than anger to build something real. It takes patience, vision, the wisdom to know that true success isn't about beating someone else. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be." Outside the hall, the breeze was soft. The moon watched from above. As Tisola stepped into the waiting car with Keenan, the lights of Nduma stretched before her, not as walls to break through, but as roads she now owned. She had been the overlooked sister. Now, she was the name everyone would remember. 10 years had passed since that unforgettable day at Oluma Cathedral. Nduma had changed. The city had grown taller, louder, richer. More towers now reached for the skies, their glass faces glittering beneath the rising sun. Markets had turned into malls, and the once whispered name of Tisola Obade was now spoken boldly in boardrooms, courtrooms, and lecture halls across the continent. On the 42nd floor of the Obade Oladeji Tower, Tisola stood quietly by a wide window, looking out at the city she once walked through as a shadow. Below, the river Osafe sparkled like a ribbon of silver. People moved like ants, some rushing, some floating, all unaware that the woman watching from above had once been invisible among them. She wore a deep burgundy bubu with golden embroidery, her braids coiled into a regal bun. Her fingers, still slender, tapped the edge of a folder on her desk. Her phone buzzed with back-to-back meeting requests, and her inbox overflowed with invitations, universities requesting guest lectures, presidents offering seats at summits, global investors begging for partnerships. She glanced at a photo framed in gold. It showed a younger Tisola in her wedding gown, standing at the altar, head held high. Behind her, slightly blurred, was Zelina, her expression frozen in shock, the weight of defeat carved into her face. Tisola smiled faintly. That photo had become more than memory. It was a symbol, not of triumph over her sister, but of the moment she had finally stepped into her truth. The empire she had built now stretched far beyond Nduma. She owned shares in 27 law firms across East and West Africa, sat on the board of 3 international legal councils, and had launched a foundation that trained brilliant girls from poor villages to become future legal giants. Her success was undeniable, and yet it had never been built on shouting. Tisola had grown powerful not through noise but through clarity, not through revenge, but through creation. And most of all, through patience. She thought back to Zelina's final message, sent 10 years ago, just hours before Tisola and Keenan boarded the plane to Zanzibar for their honeymoon. Now, a decade later, Tisola reflected on that message with quiet certainty. Zelina had tried. That much was true. She had opened 2 firms, one in Nairobi, one in Johannesburg. Both failed within 18 months. She launched a podcast calling herself a legal reformist, but her voice never caught fire. She wrote a book, then disappeared for a while. Each time she re-emerged, the same problem followed her. She was still building with bitterness, still chasing shadows, still measuring her growth against Tisola's name, and that Tisola knew was a doomed strategy. Success, real success, was not about outrunning others. It was about running your own race, eyes forward, not sideways. Her phone buzzed again. This time a message from her assistant. Another merger confirmed. Hobadi Advisory Holdings now owns 65% of Okoye and Partners. They'll sign tomorrow. Tisola nodded. Another giant added to the family. As she sat back at her desk, her eyes caught a framed quote on the wall. It was written in her own handwriting, words she'd once said aloud at the height of her confrontation with Zelina. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one building the loudest legacy. She thought of her parents next. Mama Ireti had softened in her old age. She now proudly introduced Tisola as my daughter who changed the face of Nduma's legal world. Baba Dairo, though still stoic, had finally apologized. Not with words, but with actions. He now wore a wristwatch Tisola gifted him, engraved with the words, "To the girl you never saw coming." They had grown to understand her, and perhaps more importantly, to respect her. As for Keenan, he had become more than a husband. He was her partner in every storm. They had grown together, his name powerful in his own right, but never threatened by hers. They raised 2 children together, both curious, bold, and filled with the kind of love Tisola never saw in her own childhood. Sometimes at night, she told them stories, not fairy tales, but truths, about strength, about silence, about a woman who was once overlooked and chose not to stay that way. A soft knock came at the door. It was Kioma, her longtime chief of operations. "There's a car waiting. Your keynote at the Global Legal Summit is in an hour." Tisola stood. She glanced once more at the city below. It looked smaller now, not because it had shrunk, but because she had grown. As she walked out of her office, she passed the walls lined with photos of partnerships, awards, milestones. And then, at the very end, a final frame, Zelina's resignation letter, unsent, unfinished, but printed and saved. Because for all the pain her sister caused, Tisola had never wanted to erase her. She just wanted to rise without permission. And she had. Her heels clicked against the marble as she stepped into the elevator. The doors closed slowly, and in that quiet, soft hum of the descent, Tisola smiled, not because she had beaten her sister, but because she had become who she was always meant to be. Never underestimate the one who builds in silence. True power does not come from applause or pride, but from patience, wisdom, and focus. While others chase praise, the wise lay bricks, and when their house stands tall, it speaks for them. The loudest revenge is not in shouting back, but in rising so high no one can pull you down again. If this story touched your heart, taught you a lesson, or gave you chills, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More powerful African tales are waiting for you right here. See you in the next one, besties.